Saturday, the 18th of December, 1982, Shabbat Miketz, the second Shabbat of Chanukah. Does everybody have a Chumash? Does anybody not have a Chumash? Okay, page 159. I propose to read the 42nd chapter of the book of Genesis, which is our reading this morning, from a translation different from the one that you have in front of you, the new translation published by the Jewish Publication Society of America. And after the chapter, I hope that all of you will participate in the discussion on the meaning of this chapter and raise questions which may concern you in this reading. I particularly welcome the participation of the Machon class of our SAJ Hebrew School here this morning. They have already formulated some very interesting questions on this chapter, and I hope they will raise some of those questions which they thoughtfully prepared ahead of time in the discussion. And basically what we are trying to do is to understand the themes, especially the themes that are constantly repeated in the Torah that we are reading in public, these Shabbatot. So in your Chumashim, it is on page 42, page 159, chapter 42, and I am reading from a new translation. When Jacob saw that there were food rations to be had in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you keep looking at one another? Now I hear," he went on, "that there are rations to be had in Egypt. Go down and procure rations for us there, that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to get grain rations in Egypt. For Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, since he feared that he might meet with disaster. Thus the sons of Israel were among those who came to procure rations for the famine extended to the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was the vizier of the land. It was he who dispensed rations to all the people of the land, and Joseph's brothers came and bowed low to him with their faces to the ground. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he acted like a stranger toward them and spoke harshly to them. He asked them, "Where do you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan, to procure food." For though Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Recalling the dreams that he had dreamed about them, Joseph said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the land in its nakedness." But they said to him, "No, my lord, truly your servants have come to procure food. We are all of us sons of the same man. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies." And Joseph said to them, "No, you have come to see the land in its nakedness." And they replied, "We, your servants, were 12 brothers, sons of a certain man in the land of Canaan. The youngest, however, is now with our father, and one is no more." But Joseph said to them, "It is just as I have told you. You are spies. By this you shall be put to the test. Unless your youngest brother comes here, by Pharaoh you shall not depart from this place. Let one of you go and bring your brother, while the rest of you remain confined, that your words may be put to the test, whether there is truth in you. Else by Pharaoh you are nothing but spies." And he confined them in the guardhouse for 3 days. On the third day Joseph said to them, "Do this and you shall live, for I am a God-fearing man. If you are honest men, let one of you brothers be held in your place of detention, while the rest of you go and take home rations for your starving households. But you must bring me your youngest brother, that your words may be verified and that you may not die. And they did accordingly. They said to one another, Alas, we are being punished on account of our brother, because we looked on at his anguish, yet paid no heed as he pleaded with us. That is why this distress has come upon us. Then Reuben spoke up and said to them, Did I not tell you, do no wrong to the boy? But you paid no heed. Now comes the reckoning for his blood. They did not know that Joseph understood, for there was an interpreter between him and them. Joseph turned away from them and wept. But he came back to them and spoke to them, and he took Simeon from among them and had him bound before their eyes. Then Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, return each one's money to his sack, and give them provisions for the journey. And this was done for them. So they loaded their asses with the rations and departed from there. As one of them was opening his sack to give feed to his ass at the night encampment, he saw his money right there at the mouth of his bag, and he said to his brothers, My money has been returned. It is here in my bag. Their hearts sank, and trembling they said to one another, What is this that God has done to us? When they came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had befallen them, saying, The man who is the Lord of the land spoke harshly to us and accused us of spying on the land. We said to him, We are honest men. We have never been spies. There were 12 of us brothers, sons by the same father. But one is no more, and the youngest is now with our father in the land of Canaan. But the man who was Lord of the land said to us, By this I shall know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers with me, and take something for your starving households, and be off. And bring your youngest brother to me, that I may know that you are not spies, but honest men. I will then restore your brother to you, and you shall be free to move about in the land. As they were emptying their sacks, there in each one's sack was his money bag. When they and their father saw their money bags, they were dismayed. Their father Jacob said to them, It is always me that you bereave. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you would take away Benjamin. These things always happen to me. Then Reuben said to his father, You may kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my care, and I will return him to you. But Jacob said, My son must not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he alone is left. If he meets with disaster on the journey you are taking, you will send my white head down to Sheol in grief. Well, the story, of course, continues, and it has previous elements that we have not read out, but I think that is a sufficient piece of the text to entertain questions and comments. Does anything grab you in this reading? Are you angry with anything that anybody did? Do you think it was appropriate that Joseph behaved? Let me read the questions that the Machon class raised. I'm not going to deal with them one by one because I don't want this to be a static talk. I want it to be a dynamic discussion. But here's some of their questions. Why did the brothers tell Joseph about themselves as the 12 brothers? Benjamin and Joseph weren't there. I presume they could have just said they were 10. And they'd have got out of a lot of trouble. Oh, except, of course, they didn't realize that Joseph would have known that they were lying. How come Joseph wanted to see Benjamin? Why did Joseph pick Simeon to stay? Why did Joseph put the money back in the sacks? Why didn't Joseph tell them that he was their brother, presumably straight away? Why did he make them sweat? That's my extra comment. Why was Joseph more favorite than Benjamin? Why was there an interpreter? Why did Joseph accuse them of being spies? Those and other questions I'd like to entertain now on the part of members or visitors in the congregation.
I'm struck, and I find myself angry at Jacob's tone of, you always do these things to me. I'm this poor, aggrieved person with a total innocence. And I don't like Jacob's flavor of innocence. Obviously, he's created a family dynamic where all things are not well. And yet he turns on them as if it's all their fault. And I find myself disturbed by that in the dynamic.
Did you all hear that? Judith is upset with Jacob. She feels that that Jacob should not be so querulous, I presume. He sounds a bit of a moaner. Yes, Reba?
Jacob treats these sons of Leah as though they were really his stepchildren. His
Excuse me, I really, could the ushers help me, please? I have a very sore throat this morning, and I can't have a child making noises throughout my remarks. Could we please have, please, I'm sorry, the child will have to leave the synagogue while I'm talking. Yes, please, sorry. Those two are very important points. Does anybody have a reaction to those points? One, why is Jacob such an old fuddy-duddy? I think basically that's what you were saying.
I was saying, why does he hold himself so guiltless in this process of dissension among his sons, and then...
What are you saying then? Are you accusing him of some of the trouble?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think he has to be seen as... I mean, in a family where brothers will sell each other, or some brothers will sell another brother, there's something wrong in the family. And I don't hold the parents guiltless in the formation of whatever's going on there, and then for him to come back as if the sons have done this to him totally without his set up that dynamic.
Judith is making a very important point. She's saying that in the family dynamics of Joseph and Jacob and his sons, it would appear that certain of the things that Jacob did resulted in the kind of behavior that we are seeing described this morning. That it wasn't the reason why Joseph wants to treat them badly is that he was sold. Jacob can't just act like the wicked son in the Haggadah and say, why are you in this mess? Leave me out of it. I've got my own troubles. And it's a very good point. I don't know why, Judith, however, that without denying the validity of what you were saying, I feel a great sympathy for Jacob. I wonder when somebody gets beyond a certain age, you can stop punishing them for not having raised their children in the right way. There should be a statute of limitation on raising children. All those in favor of a statute of limitation on raising children? Right, very good. I mean, I'm getting tired of parents being accused. The child is 90 years old, and the parent is still being accused because the 90-year-old child is behaving in this particular way. I mean, when does it end already? I mean, even the Germans have been forgiven. I mean, we buy Volkswagen. I mean, so I feel sorry for Jacob. He's an old man. Yes, he's a fool. He's a swindler. He's a deceiving person. He chisels. He ripped off things from Esau. He's not a nice person at all. He's not the kind of person I'd like to entertain at an afternoon cocktail party. However, he's old and he's suffered. I mean, I'm not denying what you're saying. Yeah, but when people get beyond a certain age, the faults that they had already simply get magnified. And selfishness, I suppose, is part of the way in which people hold on to life at a certain age. Can't we give Jacob some kind of, all right, I don't know. But I hear what you're saying. In fact, I think my problem is I have to ask myself. I think I know the answer, why I feel I have to defend Jacob. So, Reba's point is also extremely pertinent, namely, that one of the worst things about Jacob, I think, is that he so shamelessly makes favorites among his children. He shamelessly favors one wife. I don't know what the situation was when you had more than one wife. That must have been difficult anyway, not to make distinctions between one wife and the other. And we know that there was a lot of quarreling between the wives. And a lot of rivalry, enormous rivalry and competition. Who had more children, basically. But Jacob shamelessly makes it quite clear to the children at all times that the two children of Rachel, his favorite wife, Benjamin and Joseph, are superior to the other 10. And he wonders why they threw Joseph into the pit or sold him, depending which version of the story you take, and why he's very nervous about Benjamin. Incidentally, it's curious because Jacob is clearly an old man already. You'd think that he'd stop worrying about Benjamin. You'd think Benjamin could look after himself now. I don't think Benjamin is exactly 14 years old at this point of the proceedings. He must be fairly advanced because a lot of time has passed. It reminds me a little bit of that movie I Never Sang for My Father, where The son is almost 50 years old, and the father is still telling him to make sure he wears his coat in winter and not to knock down the garage as he drives out of the you know. I mean, unfortunately, parents tend to see their children well into their 8th or 9th decade as if they are still their children, and it irritates children very often to be in that situation. So we haven't solved that question. Robert?
Well, the part that made was when Ruben said that I'll slay my 2 sons and I'll bring them back. What's that going to solve?
I suspect that the reason why you don't like that bit, Robert, has something to do with the reason why I'm trying to defend Jacob. It depends what part of the chronological scale you're at. I wouldn't have thought of that as... I thought it was pretty outrageous. Robert feels that the worst part, the part that he doesn't like about this chapter, is when Reuben says that... he said, I will kill my 2 sons if I don't bring him back. Robert feels that that's... see, the secret in life, Robert, is for you to be able to think of my concerns and for me to be able to think of your concerns. We should have thought of the opposite things. Then we really would be studying Torah. As long as one is only in this for what one can get out of it for oneself is a dangerous thing. It is a very wild and... What do you make of this? What do you make of this statement? Reuben saying, I will kill both of my sons if I don't bring him back. How do you react to that? Oren?
Then you must be pretty sure that he's going to bring Benjamin back.
But do you think he had to make such an outrageous kind of statement? Couldn't he have said to his father, I'll let you have my savings book, CD, that's right, I was thinking of that as only yesterday. You can have my CDs until I come back. I mean, was there no way of providing a deposit other than this statement, I'll kill my 2 boys? It is a very stark kind of comment, and in one way it continues from Judith's point. It's a sad comment that the father has raised children. Don't forget, this is a family that killed all those people, the entire tribe of whom one raped, or so-called raped, Dinah. And it's a sad comment that to try to get the father to be realistic, a child has to offer to kill the father's grandchildren before the child. Julian? Approximately how old is Reuben at this stage? I don't know. Does anybody want to help out? Approximately how old would Reuben be right now? I can safely say that none of these are teenagers. They must be, I would say, in their 4th or 5th decade at least. They must be over 40 or 50. Approximately? Myron? I would think so. Right, that's right. Joseph was thrown into the pit at 17. Then he has to get to Egypt. Then he has to work for Potiphar's wife, for Potiphar. Then he has to be thrown into prison for many years and forgotten. Then he comes out, and he's been in Egypt in the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. So I think if you add that up together, you get something between 40 and 50 years old. Bobby?
It's just noted that when he's appointed administrator, he's 30.
He is 30. But he was one of the youngest brothers. Brothers are all older, at least 10 years older, because Rachel couldn't have children for a long, long time. Do we have any more reactions to any of these points or new points? Yes?
It's just very odd. It appears that all the brothers are still living at home, like 30, 35.
That's a lovely point. That's a lovely point. Julian is surprised that all the brothers are still living at home. He sees it like some Lower East Side patriarchal family, and it's time already they got out and had a room for themselves in Scarsdale or somewhere, right? Julian, you see, again, when you get to my age, you'll realize that the dream of all parents is to have all the children within one block so you can all get together for Saturday afternoon tea. Briefly. What? Well, believe it or not, Julian, there was a time when people believed it was a good thing to have extended families and everybody should get together from time to time. Now everybody runs in opposite directions. And so families tend to be rather disrupted. A lot of people don't have grandparents. I mean, just go back 100 years. I think many of us here have recollections from our own parents and grandparents that it was very common. You had a big house, and when the children got married, they lived at home, and even if they worked out, and somehow they managed to reconcile their problems and and cope and live together somehow. But it is an interesting perspective from the standpoint of a young man in the 20th century to look back and say, what were all those 40 and 50-year-old sons who are already married and have children of their own still living at home? I suppose they didn't have big houses with 4 stories. We're talking about encampments or whatever, and presumably it means in the immediate vicinity. But there are other things in this chapter that cry out for acknowledgement. Yes, Elisha.
I'm puzzled by the reference here in verse 9, chapter 22. And Joseph measured the dream which he dreamed of them. I haven't been able to find those anywhere.
Oh, very simple. Those are the dreams which Joseph, you see, Joseph also wasn't a bunch of sweet peas. He had some dreams about his brothers in which they were gathering sheaves in the field. And suddenly all the brothers' sheaves stood up and bowed down to his sheaf. And another dream that he had was that the sun and the moon and the stars were all bowing down to him. You can get these 2 dreams on page 141. Just look at page 142, actually. We did not read this section, so we should just look at it. On page 142, verse 7, we were binding sheaves in the field. My sheaf arose, stood upright. One doesn't have to be a Freudian analyst in order to understand the implications of what Joseph is saying to his brothers. Mine is bigger and better and has greater survival value. And his brethren said to him, shout thou. And in other words, the brothers took this as chutzpah. This little pisher was coming to them and saying, you're all going to grovel. I'm going to be the numero uno. And then the second dream was the sun and the moon and the 11 stars all bowed. In other words, the sheaves weren't enough. The sun and the moon and the 11 stars had to bow down, which would be his brothers and his parents and his father. His mother is already dead. So these are the dreams. Now, of course, it's one thing to have a dream about your brothers in this vein, or 2 dreams. It's another thing to communicate it to them. You know, one of the most subtle things one of the deadliest and subtle games that siblings play with each other is to pretend they're being honest when they're digging the knife in. But I thought you'd want to know. I'm only telling the truth. I mean, I didn't want to upset you. I just thought you'd like to know that, you know, this is the case and so-and-so is the case. Julian?
Well, going back to here again, it appears that Jacob doesn't like to put down, because it says here, Jacob rebuked him for the implication that he would bow down to his son.
Yes, but you get the impression that Jacob didn't do it on a scale of 0 to 10, or 10. He was sort of rebuking him rather half-heartedly. Why do you think Jacob would have rebuked Joseph for the telling the brothers the dreams half-heartedly?
Because it's just, I'm not going to rebuke him. He's my favorite. He just didn't mean it.
Oh, he did mean it. I think Jacob doesn't rebuke Joseph when he tells the dreams. For what reason? Samara?
Well, I think he rebuked him because he thought his dreams were right.
Absolutely. I agree with Samara completely. I think Jacob was one of those fathers who half-heartedly rebukes their child when the child behaves outrageously, because in a sense the father really approves of what the child is doing. And incidentally, this entire topic of the way in which children very often exemplify in their lives the things that their parents wanted to do but either didn't have the guts to do or weren't conscious that they wanted to do them is a very common phenomenon. Very often, for example, a very traditional parent, Orthodox parent, will have a child who breaks out all over the place, and sometimes what the child is doing is picking up some very subtle aspirations which were never articulated by the parent. And the parent doesn't want to rebuke because the parent recognizes that on some level the other half of what the child is doing is up here. And this happens not just with Jews, it happens in many other areas. The very subtle interplay in which other people very often deal with the unfinished business of your own life. Husbands and wives do this to each other, and parents and children do this to each other. And Jacob is a classical example of somebody who says, you mustn't say that, Joseph, but inside, why shouldn't he be delighted? What it means is that the child of Rachel, his favorite wife, is going to be the center of attraction. That's what he wants. He doesn't want fraternity among these brothers. He doesn't want to say to the brothers, look, I love you all. I don't like hearing this nonsense about, well, he doesn't do that because his heart, as Samara says, is in the dreams. Judith?
And I think half heartedly is exactly the right word, but I think parents with half their heart want their children to outshine them, and the and feed me.
That's another theme altogether. That's another theme altogether. That parents are ambivalent about their children's success.
The wish for it and
Yep.
the fear of it are
Right, and I think that comes out in the story. In this story also, but there are many more elements here that I think. Yes, Claire.
Well, Joseph knows that he is the favorite son. He has had a relationship where he has been much admired and treated well by his father. In doing what he's doing now, however, he's prolonging the agony for his father, who doesn't know what's going on, feels that strange happenings have taken place. The younger son is now being asked to go to the strange land before the strange man.
Yes.
I'm wondering why Joseph would do something so harsh to his father.
Yes.
With these people.
Yes, I think that's an excellent point. Claire, it draws our attention to what I think is even worse than Robert's complaint about the Reuben offering his two sons. Namely, that it's true that Joseph may find that vengeance is sweet. And now he has all those brothers about, first of all, he had dreams when he was 17 years old, who, in reaction to his showing off the coat of many colors that his father bought him, threw him into the pit and sold him. You might have thought that the time that had elapsed between his being sold and being thrown into the pit and going to Egypt, you know, when you experienced and being in prison, he'd have said, well, it's true, they did throw me into the pit, but you know what? I wasn't a bunch of sweet peas either. It's true that what they did was bad, but I almost asked for it. I would flaunt my favorite status in the family. I showed off this coat of many colors which my father bought me only and not them. It's true they were a bit harsh to me, but they didn't kill me, and I did ask for it. Not only does Joseph appear not to have gone through that particular kind of maturation and growth, where one can forgive one's former enemies because one understands that they weren't just enemies in a vacuum. There was, you know, it takes two to tango. Joseph had his complicity in what went on between the two. No brother throws another brother into the pit unless both sides had something. Never believe any family story which is all black and all white. Some years ago there was a marvelous double movie in which a divorce, two separate movies in which a divorce was shown from the standpoint of the husband and the standpoint of the wife. I don't have to tell you that there were two different movies. And we all know Rashomon. That is to say, the same event can look completely different from two different perspectives. I think what Claire is saying, however, not only does Joseph not indicate that there has been any growth or maturation at all, that he's still a nasty little piece of work. He doesn't want to say to his brothers, okay, I'm Joseph, it's true that you did this nasty thing to me, but I wasn't such a marvelous guy. And look, it's a long time, a lot of water has gone down the river Nile or whatever. He makes his old father, who is an inch away from the grave, suffer terribly. He is sending the boy, first of all, he shows a kind of an instability of judgment. First of all, he wants to lock all of them up and send one back to Canaan. 3 days later, he changes his mind and says only one has to be locked up and all of you go back. So he's not so in control of the situation as he might give the appearance of. And he's milking this in terms of vengeance as far as he can go. He is going I don't think he wants to hurt his father deliberately, Claire, but I think his desire to get even with his brothers is so strong that he doesn't really consider, that's my judgment, I may be wrong, he doesn't consider what his father is going to do. And the boys get back and say, one more of your children is in prison in Egypt, and we've got to bring the one that you love most. Otherwise, we're not going to get the other one back, and we're not going to get any more food. So how could Joseph torment his father like this? I can understand a brother wanting to get even with a brother. You know, sibling rivalry can get very intense. But why would Joseph want to do this to his father?
I think that in my reading of the story, I've always felt that this story kind of exemplifies the driving force that faith had. The fate of all the people in this story are absolutely not in control of the situation. On the surface, it seems as if Joseph is, but he is in Egypt, and what's going on is
Yes, well, yes, you have raised an excellent point. There's a special name for what you've just mentioned, and there's no reason why we shouldn't give it the right name. This is a phenomenon which Hegel calls the cunning of history. What Hegel means by the cunning of history is the fact that events that transpire on the historical scene appear to have one dimension, but very often have another dimension altogether. That people who are, this is a bad example, but it's an example I like to give, that in the Weimar Republic, the communists and the socialists and the Nazis were fighting as if the issue was only between them and the other party. What happened was ultimately, because the socialists and the communists cancelled each other out, the Nazis came into power. They didn't want the Nazis to come into power. In fact, if you had told them that the way they were behaving was ultimately going to lead to a Nazi-dominated Europe, they would never have been able to understand it. The cunning of history is the way in which people can consciously feel that they are doing certain things for conscious reasons and conscious motives, but on another level, a whole different thing is being worked out. Of course, the one who has worked this through more than most in the modern world is Richard Rubenstein, who's just published a new book called Triage, published by Boston, Beacon Press in Boston. I haven't seen that book yet, but he actually wrote a book called, I think, The Cunning of Reason, a play on Hegel's term, The Cunning of History. Was it called The Cunning of History? It was called The Cunning of History. Now here we have a prime example of what Hegel is talking about, and which the previous comment underlines. And in fact, the Midrash understood this very well. It so happens, I just happen to have in front of me the Midrash which I used last week, which is a classical example of what we mean by the cunning of history. It is in the name of Shmuel, the son of Nachman, and it is a comment on a verse from the book of Jeremiah. I know the thoughts that I think towards you, saith God. The tribes were busy selling Joseph. Joseph was busy wearing sackcloth and fasting in prison. Reuben had gone to the pit to find Joseph and didn't find him, and he was mourning. Jacob was fasting because he believed Joseph was dead. Judah was busy finding himself a woman, while the Holy One, blessed be He, was busy creating the light of the Messiah. You may remember that I quoted this last week to indicate that, in other words, in this chapter we have a perfect example of what Hegel means by the cunning of history. Everybody thinks they're doing their thing, but behind the scenes God is doing His thing. That the whole purpose of Joseph going to Egypt, Joseph being sold into Egypt, the brothers thought they were selling him because they hated him. That may be true on one level, but on another level they were doing God's will. That is to say, there was a divine purpose behind everything that was going on. I suppose this is something that on a small level all of us often experience in life, where certain disappointments or even successes happen to us, and other things either come or don't come our way because of various things. And very often we try very hard consciously to do certain things, to accomplish certain goals in our lives, but in fact when we look back on our lives, it's the unconscious motivations, the things that were going on under the surface, that in fact guided us most truly and most surely to our course. Linda, you had your hand up?
I just wanted to say that Rabbi felt that Joseph was selfish. And his father, I remember reading something in Rashi years ago that we were talking about him, about Joseph being at Potiphar's house and looking beautiful. And they even suggested that he was doing something like making up his own.
Oh yes, mascara.
While his father was mourning, looking at the bloodstained coat, and he was not, he was a very self-centered person.
Yes, well, it's been pretty evident to all of us following this saga of the book of Genesis this year that God chooses very strange families to work His purpose through. I mean, I feel this will be a marvelous agenda for a social work institution to have the students write papers on the patriarch's family from the standpoint of modern family dynamics. I mean, how would this look as a case history? I mean, actually, each family or the entire family presented as a longitudinal study in depth of what happens from one generation to the next when you have these favoritisms and so on and so forth. I think this is true. Somebody have their hand up in the middle there? Yes. I can't hear. Would you like to stand?
In response to your historical comment, just like the threat of the conquering power wasn't enough to determine, so too when Jacob gave the katana custody to Joseph, even though he knew he was perpetuating favoritism, it also didn't make any difference. And you can make even a common analogy today when a father gives a Mercedes to one child and not another.
You think it doesn't do any harm?
It certainly does do harm, but it's not enough to determine. I don't think a father or role model from the historical context to the family dynamic situation, that person is able to understand the ramifications of that gift or act.
But you don't think it was appropriate to give him a coat of many colors?
No, not at all.
Thank you. Yes, Marion.
2 points. I think there's a contrary way to looking at this part today. And the contrary point is that Joseph has matured. And I disagree with
You think he has matured?
I think he has matured. And the reason is, if I were Joseph, and now I'm projecting, I mean, the real question is, why don't we just go and kill these guys as soon as they came? After all, I hold the words a long time if I feel it.
And you're going to upset Roberts if you carry on like this.
But what's happened here is that what Joseph sets up are a series of tests. And I think those tests are to test whether those brothers have matured in the same way he has. Joseph has already made it. He's made it all the way through to the top, as far as he can go in Egypt. And I find him in this chapter for the first time to be compassionate. He turns around and cries when he hears his brother Reuben say, "We have a guilty conscience, and this is the reason this must be happening to us." And he attempts to sow dissension among his brothers. But instead of taking it out on a particular brother, whether it be Simeon or whoever gets the money opened in the cask when the sack after they leave, or Benjamin later on with the cup, whoever it is, the brothers stick together, offer to sacrifice the most valuable parts of their households, whether it be the children or not. And I think that what Joseph has done is to see, are his brothers worth saving at this point? Are they willing to preserve the Hebrew people? Are they a proper kind of heritage? That's one projection. But clearly, Joseph is setting this up such that these brothers are set up to fight each other. And 20 years ago, when Joseph was with them, that's exactly what they would have done. But instead, they closed ranks. And I think that what this chapter is about is the beginning of that. I think that Joseph has matured, and what he's doing is trying to find out the maturity of his own brothers.
Well, I'd like to agree with you, Marion, but I'm afraid I don't. I feel very strongly that, since you mentioned it, that little extra shtoch of putting the money in the sacks was a very nasty little bit of sadistic work there, because, I mean, he knew that these people, they'd been locked up in prison for 3 whole days by the number second in command of the entire country of Egypt. And the fears that they must have had when they opened those bags, that they were going to be accused of having stolen that money also. I mean, it's amazing to me that none of the brothers had a heart attack or jumped off a rock. The fact that somebody cries is no index of maturity. And the fact that somebody makes it professionally is no index of maturity. Myron, I'm surprised at you. I know in the halls of Congress and the Senate are full of people who've made it but are extraordinarily immature by any general no, I don't see maturity. It's a point that one can disagree on. He certainly is trying to test the brothers, but I don't see maturity. I see Joseph as a spoilt brat who is now a middle-aged brat who is still in a rather vindictive way trying to make the brothers suffer. And crucially, I don't think anybody has answered Claire's point yet. What right does he have to test his brother's integrity at the expense of his own father, who easily could drop dead of all the aggravation? Yes.
In response to Claire, at this point, he doesn't know that his father is still alive. And as a matter of fact, when they
Don't the brothers tell...
they tell him exactly that they have 12 brothers, and one is dead.
But they say we are children of one man.
Don't say that the father is still alive.
But they don't say he's dead either.
Well, but the first question that Joseph has the next time they come
Is my father alive?
Is my father still alive?
Right.
So maybe he's not sure that Jacob is still alive, and he wants to
Right. Okay, yes, there is a point there. On the other hand, I think in terms of the rough and tumble of human life, I think Joseph may believe that his father is alive like 75, 80%, but still need to ask that question in the moment of truth, because people, as you know, do tend to repeat themselves. Yes?
Another point that I wanted to raise, and I also disagree with the person over there.
You agree or disagree with Marion?
Disagree.
You disagree with him?
On page 159, on the 9th verse, it says that he decided to take revenge of them, not because they stole him and they were cruel, but because he remembered the dreams that he had. So he's still in a very egocentric
That's a very good point.
stage in
Yes.
his life,
Excellent
remembering
point.
only his own dreams.
This is an excellent point. The point is made here that when Joseph sees his brothers, he doesn't remember what they did to him by way of tearing off his coat and putting him into the pit and selling him to the Midianites. He remembered the narcissistic dreams that he had about them when he was going to be top dog, and that was why, in other words, the impression then clearly given is, now by the end of this experience, you're going to know who's on top. There'll be no more arguments about who's in charge. And this, I think, adds to the notion of a kind of a vindictiveness here. Elisha?
Well, you're looking for a motivation why Joseph should butcher, to use the Yiddish expression, his father, Jacob, and I think I may have a motivation for you. If you grant this kind of personality that Joseph has, being self-centered, I can easily imagine that such a personality would say, why didn't my father come and rescue me when I was in this pit? And I'm going to get even with him for not coming to save me. If the whole universe has to revolve around me, and if my brothers throw me in the pit, then my father, who's always taken care of me, should come and rescue me. And when he doesn't, so I'm going to get even with him too.
That's an incredible point. Yes, that's a very interesting point. In other words, Elisha is saying that not only is Joseph angry with his brothers, he's furious with his father in the way in which only a spoilt child can be angry with his father. In other words, he feels that his father should have been omnipotent and put an ad in the New York Times saying, lost one child, or whatever, Joseph answering to the subscription. Is this Naomi?
To add to that point, you said before that if brothers put another brother in the pit, it has something to do with the parents. And maybe on some level Joseph is aware of that he got into this mess because his father picked him to be top dog, and that's why his brothers hated him.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting point. Naomi is saying that on some level, I don't think all of this is conscious, on some level, when a father in that kind of a context deliberately picks out one of the youngest children to be the favorite and spends more money on him and buys him better clothes than the others, and then that son comes to grief, on reflection in later life, the youngest son, after growing up, may look back and say, on some fields, on some level, his father set him up for this. And that might explain on some level why he wants to get his own back on a lot of them. He's furious with all of them. The brothers for doing it in the first instance, and his father for not stopping it, or for being responsible for having set him up in the first place. Julian?
I'm surprised that Joseph, in a way, is pleased with his brothers. If they hadn't thrown him in the pit and sold him to Ishmaelites, how would he even get to Egypt and do business?
Yes, it's a marvelous point. Julian raises a very interesting question. Why should Joseph be so angry with his brothers? After all, then, had they not sold him to the Midianites, he wouldn't be the second in command in Egypt. In other words, he would still be, there are many Yiddish jokes to this effect. The man who couldn't write, and he became a multimillionaire because he couldn't write. Had he been able to write, he'd have taken the first job that came along. And I think there is a point here that in a sense, Joseph could say, well, you did me but he does, actually. He says, you thought you were doing me a bad turn by putting me into the pit. But Elohim chashav tova, God made it turn out okay. That's the cunning of history again. Oren?
Well, it's not that how it came out, that they weren't figuring that this was going to happen. They did it they hated him. Not that, well, we already know that he's going to go to Egypt and he's going to be top dog. That's not why they did it.
Oren, I like what you say. I see you don't have anything to do with the idea of the cunning of history. And you're right, of course. People should be judged on the level that they make their decisions. You can't just come in afterwards with some beautiful metaphysical flowery explanation and say, well, yes, it's true, they did throw him in, but they were doing God's deeds. When they did it, they weren't doing God's deeds. That's God's problem. They were doing him in. That's a very, very fine point. Sandra.
One of the things that struck me about it is Joseph almost is a representative of the state of Israel, in the sense that when he finally gets to be top, after having gone through a succession of very bad times, the desire to want to say to everybody else, tough, you know, you kicked me around for such a long time. Now it's my turn, and I'm going to do this for as long
Yes.
as I can.
Okay. Good.
But at the same time, there is a sense of compassion in there. I mean, it's not all bad, but there is that real desire to want to, when you're on top, to want to stay there and prolong it as long as you possibly can and get as much as you possibly can.
That's a very, very interesting point. I'm sure that I am not the only person here today who was terribly saddened at the account in the New York Times yesterday of Ariel Sharon's visit to Latin America and the way in which Israel is now selling masses of weapons to countries which America cannot sell to because of those countries' abuses of human rights. We've really come full circle. In other words, there are certain countries in South America that America, even America, will not sell weapons to because of the poor record in those countries of human rights. And those are the markets which Israel has now picked up. And at the same time as feeling that somehow we all have a lot of agonizing soul-searching to do, you had to look at the other side also. And that was what Sandra was saying, that having been in the pit and sold and badly abused by the nations of the world for so long, one has to make an allowance for the Israelis for at least a period of time to act, well, I'm afraid Joseph is not much of a role model of them to follow, but one can understand why they say, we will do what we like. I mean, President Reagan says, you've got to get out of Lebanon, and the Israelis say, yes, sir, and promptly dig cement basements and fortresses and foundations and have no intention of moving, at least for the time being. So again, this is this agonizing opposition. Ruth?
I think there's an enormous and very important difference between Joseph and his actions and Israel's actions that really should be mentioned. That is that Joseph was invited to power, was secure in his power, and really, I think Myron had the point, had come through in a sense of passage and had arrived. Israel, on the other hand, has fought for every inch and iota of power that it has or doesn't have, and is continuing to fight for that kind of power. Now, playing with realpolitik in this day and age, Israel is doing things. I share your concern that I'm certainly not proud of. I don't think we should be proud of. But I think as far as equating Joseph and his position with Israel's position in the world is not right and leads to a host of even more problematic issues.
I don't think Sandra meant, or I meant it absolutely literally, but there does seem to be some kind of naughty boy kind of attitude. We'll do what we like and cocking a snook at the rest of the world because we were treated so badly. Dr. Halpern?
I think you used the word the cunning of history, not the morality of history. Joseph is presented as a person of intelligence, not necessarily of morality, and I think the story is cast in such a way that the people who are seen as intelligent are not always seen as totally admirable, which I think is a very nice thing.
You like that?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to wind this up right now because I'm slowly losing my voice, and I have one more reading I want to share with you at the end of the service. Many of you responded in a way that I would not have anticipated to the very brief reading I gave you last week, just at the end of the service, in connection with a concentration camp celebration of Hanukkah. Quite by accident, on Thursday night, somebody gave me a book, and I opened the book, And the first thing that my eyes rested upon was this reading that I want to read to you before the end of the service, and I just wanted to share it with you. There'll be no discussion on it, but it will certainly, I think, put some perspective into what we've been talking about. Very briefly, in terms of the overall theme that we've been discussing for the last several weeks, this is the heart of the myth which has kept the Jewish people going for over 2,000 years, but which is now somewhat threadbare. And the central thrust of the theme, and this is the reason why in the book of Genesis we have so many examples of people who look as if they are one thing, but in fact are something else. Because this particular myth was written at a time when the Jewish people was at a very low ebb in their fortunes. And the argument ran something like this: we are God's chosen people. But is this what chosen people look like? Everybody despises and condemns us. We will be like Joseph. We may be in prison. We may be in sackcloth and ashes. But God knows who we are. And if we hang in long enough, ultimately, what appears to be the case will not be the case, and vice versa. Those who look now as if they are powerless will end up being the ones in power. And those who appear to be in power will end up the ones being powerless. So that is a very central theme that is raised in the Bible. There's one final point I wanted to share with the congregation, because I think about every week since Yom Kippur, we've been raising the question of why God works through the most unadmirable families. Or even more focused, why does God produce the Messiah from incestuous relationships? I think one of the reasons is, first of all, the business about the Messiah coming from an incestuous relationship. I finally discovered the answer to that this week, and I felt very sad because it was so obvious, and one of us should have hit on it before. It's very simple. You see, before Judaism with its patriarchal religion came along, there was a very powerful mother goddess religion in the ancient world. And the central act in the worship of the Magna Mater, or the Great Mother, was incest between the mother and either her own child or her consort. Judaism fought the mother goddess religion with a power and a force almost unprecedented in the history of religions. And one of the ways in which you fight a religion which is tempting to your own devotees and you want to seduce them away from it is to take a central vital element in their myth and place it at the heart of your own myth, but in such a way that it can no longer mean what it meant to the original proponents of the myth, but instead has a very important and sensitive role to play in your new myth. And in general, I think the reason why our ancestors had these peculiar forms of behavior in the Bible, first of all, is because most of us have peculiar forms of family life anyway, to a greater or lesser extent. What is it that Tolstoy said? You never hear about happy families. It's the other ones that are more interesting. And I suppose that by comparison, you come to Shul and you see what Jacob, who was after all one of the patriarchs, got into. You don't feel so bad when your kids go down to Greenwich Village and decide to move out of the house at the age of 13 and become cocaine pushers. Because you say, well, if Joseph and the brothers, they were killing each other. At least, this is just drugs or whatever. In other words, you come to Shul, instead of having plaster saints presented to you every single week, so you go away from Shul feeling worse than you did already, because certainly your children can't compare to what you're reading. You come to Shul and you hear other people's sorrows. Even Abraham had trouble. Isaac had trouble. Jacob had trouble. You go back, your kids don't look so bad at Shabbos lunch anymore. And also I think there's another very important fact. No myth, no religion, no cultural teaching will long endure if it does not appeal to all the dimensions of the human psyche. Our religion must not only appeal to our aesthetic sense. Our myths must not only appeal to our sense of poetry. Our rituals must not only be things that look good at a bar mitzvah or when we bring visitors to the congregation. Our myths must address themselves to the basest and the meanest, the most perverted and the most pathological of our desires. Otherwise, we will go elsewhere for those needs to be satisfied. I'm not suggesting that all these things are enjoined in the synagogue. But by coming to the synagogue over the chronological Jewish calendar year, one ultimately is exposed, manifestly or latently, consciously or unconsciously, to just about anything you can find in Kraft Ebing or Alex Comfort. And moreover, you find these variations in such a way that the idea can be entertained. I mean, I'll just give a simple example. Look, for the last 12 weeks we've been talking about incest. When you get so formatted in synagogue talking about incest, you don't feel like doing it outside because at least you're presented with the idea. I'm oversimplifying, but the idea is there. That is to say, a fully fledged, a fully developed religious myth must touch all psychic bases. And it is my hunch, although I don't have enough evidence to go on, that all those myths which ultimately survived and endured and were adaptational and enabled the groups which maintained them to hold on to them and survive were groups which reckoned not just with the sweetness and light in human life, but also with what was going on under the table. One of my lover's quarrels with Mordecai Kaplan was that, Victorian that he was, Rabbi Kaplan insisted that the synagogue only have sweetness and light. He refused to acknowledge the fact that people who come to the synagogue exist below the waist as well as above the waist. You can't just appeal to the head. You have to appeal to the whole human being. And if you just look at the Jewish calendar, just look at Purim. I mean, Purim from one point of view is disgusting. We come into synagogue, somebody mentions the name of a man who not only was hung himself, but his 12 sons were hung. And this wasn't in 1938 in Germany. This was thousands of years ago. And the Jews stamp their feet and scream as if they're the most blood. It's good. It's much better to let off your hatred in the synagogue over Haman, who's after all dead, than to let it off at home or in school or anywhere else. I'm not saying that it doesn't do, once a year isn't enough, but this is an example where the synagogue enables us in controlled circumstances, within the framework of tradition, to articulate, to express, to get in touch with certain ideas. The last story, which I will read after Adon Olam, will be my Hanukkah gift to all of you, and following that we will have a Kiddush in the social hall, sponsored by Arnie Bessler and Monica Jacobson in honor of the naming of their baby Rachel. We rise for Aleinu on page 194. Saturday, the 8th of January, 1983, Shmot. That's all right. They can share one between two. I just don't want anybody to be without anything. So if you don't have a chumash, sit next to somebody you'd like to meet. It's a good excuse, the best that I know of. I mean, what kind of a line is that? May I share your chumash? I can't quite get out of my mind that scene at the end of, is it Gilbert and Sullivan's opera Ruddigore, when in the middle of the night all the past generations come off the paintings is that right? Is that the one? Paintings on the walls. I can see Julia Sack coming in, and Blanche Ehrenstein, Marvin Bloch would have been here today, and there are many others who have passed on who are with us here in spirit, Henry, many of whom you know far better than I know, because you've been here longest. You've watched them coming and going, the SAJ, including, I regret to say, the rabbis. Now, I'm not going to read this translation that you have, I'm going to read the new translation, but I'd like you to follow on page 213, chapter 3. I'm going to read what we read in synagogue this morning, and I'm going to ask you to help me to understand it, because I don't understand it. Let me just first of all share with you something which is not quite related to what we're talking about this morning, but happened to crop up earlier this week at a discussion I was involved in which the new translation, well, I wouldn't say excelled itself, but certainly made one realize how one can get stuck with an old translation and not realize there are other things involved. We were reading under different circumstances and in a different context, the 12th chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes, which begins in Hebrew, Zchor et borecha b'mei yaldutecha, which everybody knows is translated as, remember thy Creator in the days of thy youth. Do you all know that verse? Everybody knows that verse. It's almost entered into an international religious language. It's used all over the place. But apparently it's not the right translation, according to the translators of the New Translation. The word creator in Hebrew is borei, but it's very closely related to a Hebrew word which is bari, which means healthy. In modern Hebrew, if somebody sneezes, you say labriut. So there is a view that it is not borei, creator, but bari or briut, health. And so instead of remember your Creator in the days of your youth, which really makes no sense. Why would want to remember your Creator when you're young? When you get older, you start thinking about the Creator. I beg your pardon. Was that involuntary, or is somebody trying to say something? No, it's voluntary. Thank you. All right. One has to know in this place. After all, why would one want to worry about the Creator in one's youth? That is the time when one does not want to think about the Creator. Sow your wild oats. Later on, when you're beginning to feel, you're breaking down a little bit, that is the time when one starts beginning to think of the Creator. And so, in fact, this problem is now solved. It doesn't mean remember your Creator. It means the opposite. It means, according to the translation, appreciate your vigor in the days of your youth. Before those days of sorrow come and those years arrive of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. That's a very interesting innovation, even though it may not be correct. Isn't there a saying in Italian, non è vero ma ben trovato? I don't know what this would, I think this might apply here. But it does, okay, textual variations. It does, I think, it does make more sense in the context that one should be conscious of one should appreciate one's vitality. Or I think the French have a saying, si jeunesse savait, si vieillesse pouvait. If youth knew, if old age could. And there's a famous medieval, Henry, you're not supposed to laugh at this stage, I haven't got to the jokes yet. And there is a famous English poet who wrote a poem called Gather Ye Rosebuds While Ye May. That's just what we call, Henry, a Vorspeise. And now, let's get to the main course, which I'm going to read. And this is the third chapter of the book of Exodus, page 213 in your translation. Please follow. I cannot guarantee exciting variations throughout, but you will be able to see where the new translation has differed from the old. You're on page 213, chapter 3. Now Moses, tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, drove the flock into the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. I'm going to ask you, before I begin to read, what I want you to look for, or what the question is, because then you'll be able to prepare yourself while you're listening to the reading, in addition to following the reading. In this, well, actually there are two chapters. We're going to read chapter 3 to chapter 4, verse 17. You will, I am sure, recognize any number of themes and motifs which occur in mythology throughout the world. I'm going to ask you, let's see if we can piece them all together. Standard mythological themes, standard stories which don't just apply to Moses and the episodes that we are reading about this morning, but themes that you can find repeated in cultures all over the world. Standard, universal mythological themes. However, there does appear to me to be one theme which is not, as far as I know, as far as I can ascertain, is not found anywhere else, and is the novum, is the unique newness or novelty of this chapter, these two chapters. And the question I'm going to ask is, why is this the case? What is the meaning of this new dimension? Do we find it elsewhere? It may well be that a member of the congregation recognizes this theme from elsewhere. I could not find in the sources I consulted. So we have recognizable themes, well-known themes, and something that appears to be new in the Bible. What does it mean? What can we elicit from it, from the reading this morning? Now Moses, tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, drove the flock into the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. An angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire out of a bush. He gazed, and there was a bush all aflame, yet the bush was not consumed. Moses said, I must turn aside to look at this marvelous sight. Why doesn't the bush burn up? When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses!" He answered, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not come closer. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you stand is holy ground. I am," he said, "the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord continued, "I have marked well the plight of my people in Egypt, and have heeded their outcry because of their taskmasters. Yes, I am mindful of their sufferings. I have come down to rescue them from the Egyptians, and to bring them out of that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. Moreover, I have seen how the Egyptians oppressed them. Come, therefore, I will send you to Pharaoh, and you shall free my people, the Israelites, from Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and free the Israelites from Egypt?" And he said, "I will be with you, and it shall be your sign that it was I who sent you. And when you have freed the people from Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain." Moses said to God, "When I come to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" And God said to Moses, "Ehye asher ehye." He continued, "Thus shall you say to the Israelites, 'Ehye sent me to you.'" And God said further to Moses, "Thus shall you speak to the Israelites, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This shall be my name forever, this my appellation for all eternity. Go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me and said, I have taken note of you and of what is being done to you in Egypt, and I have declared I will take you out of the misery of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, to a land flowing with milk and honey. They will listen to you. Then you shall go with the elders of Israel to the king of Egypt, and you shall say to him, The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, manifested himself to us. Now therefore, let us go a distance of 3 days into the wilderness to sacrifice to the Lord our God. Yet I know that the king of Egypt will let you go only because of a greater might. So I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with various wonders, which I will work upon them. After that he shall let you go. And I will dispose the Egyptians favorably toward this people, so that when you go, you will not go away empty-handed. Each woman shall borrow from her neighbor and the lodger in her house objects of silver and gold and clothing. And you shall put these on your sons and daughters, thus stripping the Egyptians. But Moses spoke up and said, What if they do not believe me, and do not listen to me, but say, The Lord did not appear to you? The Lord said to him, What is that in your hand? And he replied, A rod. He said, Cast it on the ground. He cast it on the ground, and it became a snake, and Moses recoiled from it. And the Lord said to Moses, Put out your hand and grasp it by the tail. He put out his hand and seized it, and it became a rod in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob did appear to you. The Lord said to him further, Put your hand into your bosom. He put his hand into his bosom, and when he took it out, his hand was encrusted with snowy scales. And he said, Put your hand back into your bosom. He put his hand back into his bosom, and when he took it out of his bosom, there it was again, like the rest of his body. And if they do not believe you or pay heed to the first sign, they will believe the second. And if they are not convinced by both these signs, and still do not heed you, take some water from the Nile, and pour it on the dry ground, and it, the water that you take from the Nile, will turn to blood on the dry ground. But Moses said to the Lord, Please, O Lord, I have never been a man of words, either in times past or now that you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. And the Lord said to him, Who gives man speech? Who makes him dumb or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, and I will be with you as you speak, and I will instruct you what to say. But he said, Please, O Lord, make someone else your agent. The Lord became angry with Moses, and he said, There is your brother Aaron the Levite. He I know speaks readily. Even now he is setting out to meet you, and he will be happy to see you. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth. I will be with you and with him as you speak, and tell both of you what to do. And he shall speak for you to the people. Thus he shall serve as your spokesman, with you playing the role of God to him. And take with you this rod with which you shall perform the signs. It just occurs to me that that last sentence is as close to a joke as you'll get in the Bible. It's as if as God is saying to Moses, you're giving me a hard time. You play God to Aaron and see what it feels like to have somebody else give you a hard time. All right, now let me just make one general comment about the chapter to begin with, which I don't think it would be fair for you to ascertain yourselves, because I didn't ascertain it myself until I looked at the sources this week. Although it is something which we all know. It's not directly related to the answering of the questions, but I think it's something we ought to notice because it is obviously on some level related. I'm going to read directly from Theodore H. Gaster's comment on this chapter. He says, we can still trace the limbs of the man, he's talking about Moses, under the gorgeous drapery of the magician who confronted Pharaoh and wrought plagues on all the land of Egypt. We can still perceive the human features through the nimbus of supernatural glory which shone on the features of the saint and prophet as he descended from the mountain where he had conversed with God and had received from the divine hands a new code of law for his people. It is indeed remarkable that though Moses stands so much nearer than the patriarchs to the borderline of history, the element of the marvelous and the miraculous enters much more deeply into his story than into theirs. It's a very interesting point that Gaster is making. He's saying, when you really look at the Bible, although Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are less historical than Moses, when you're reading about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, one still gets the impression that one might be in the realm of, if not myth, then at least legend. With Moses, one feels one is actually in history. That is to say, there's a kind of a spectrum which ranges right from Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, which clearly is pure myth, through the Bible, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, until finally we begin to get the feeling that we are actually dealing with real historical people. And yet, Gaster says, there's a curious paradox. Although the patriarchs are prehistorical in a sense, way near the beginning of the spectrum, there's very little supernatural that goes on. They don't really perform miracles. Does Abraham perform anything miraculous? Does Isaac perform anything miraculous? Does Jacob perform anything miraculous? To be sure, God keeps on talking to them, and they talk back to God. With Moses, although Moses is as close to history as we get in the Bible, he's full of the miraculous. All the signs and the wonders, the rod, the staff, the magic. This is a curious paradox, and one which might spark some thinking in your minds as we proceed to interpret this chapter. So the first question is, what parts of this reading, 1.5 chapters, are common to all cultures and civilizations? And what is the novum? What is the unique difference between these chapters, this reading, and what you might read in another mythological text? Well, let's have some of the regular things out of the way first of all. The congregation includes everybody. Everybody's invited to participate. One at a time, please. Would you like to raise your hand? Yes. Stanley, sacred mountain. Right, this is a common, sacred mountains exist in all cultures and all literature. Yes? Come on, just because Henry's here, you don't have to be shy. I'm sorry? Oh, deities who speak, surely, yes. Deities who speak, yeah, gods who speak. Yes, the magic wand. The magic wand, the magic rod. This is a very, very common phenomenon. That's the question, Jack. I'll wait for your comment. We'll wait last. I don't know whether there are any other examples of that. Yes? I'm sorry? Snake gods, yes. Well, it's not. Is it really a snake god? Is it a snake god? Because he turns. Is it really a snake god, Leslie? You think so? God gets the stick to turn into a snake. Does that make him a snake god? It does. I'll take your word for it. It associates him with the power of the snake, yes. Okay, any more examples? Joel?
Changing of water and blood.
Changing of water and blood, yes.
A leader appointed by the grace of God.
A leader appointed by the grace of God, yes. Yes.
An unwilling emissary.
Well, we've already had that up front. That's the one theme that I could not find elsewhere. So you and Jack, I would like you to think of examples in other cultures where I call it the syndrome of the reluctant prophet. of which we have several examples in the Bible, but I don't, and incidentally in literature, which emulates or is influenced by the Bible, we have reluctant prophets. I'm talking about world literature. But in myth, I don't know of other examples of reluctant prophets. But we have not yet exhausted the fund of universal mythical motifs in this reading. Laney.
Leprosy is an act of God.
Yes, in other words, a changing of the order of nature is an act of God. Leprosy, water to blood. Yes.
Stutterers in divine people.
Stutterers as divine people. Well, I would make that more general. People who are wounded in one way or another as representative of the divine. I'm thinking of the famous Greek god who was thrown from heaven and who was permanently lamed. Is his name Hephaestus? Right? Right? Any more? Yes. Divine fire, yes. Well, why are you so delicate, Jessica? You don't want to use the phrase the burning bush because the Jewish Theological Seminary has it as its logo. You think that's uniquely Jewish, don't you? You think it's uniquely Jewish? You're a rhetorical question. I don't want to put you on the spot. The burning bush motif is universal. As a matter of fact, in the 14th century, there is an example in France, in a place called Chalon, where a priest claimed to have seen a burning bush. So the idea of divine fire is an international mythological. There are some more obvious ones. Yes? A revelation in the wilderness, yes.
Holy ground.
Holy ground, yes. Come on, you've missed the obvious ones, yes.
The leader as a shepherd of the flock.
The leader is a shepherd of the flock, yes. Leah. Taking off shoes, yes. How many of you, this is a rhetorical question, I'm just playing games. How many of you think that taking your shoes off your foot is something that only occurs in the Bible? As a matter of fact, it occurs more than once in the Bible. It also occurs outside the walls of Jericho when the angel appears to Joshua and asks him to take his shoes off. As a matter of fact, this particular theme of taking your shoes off in the presence of God is found in a representation on a pallet, a devotional pallet, which was used in a temple in Egypt dating from 3000 BCE. It's called the Manna pallet. And on it there is a representation of a king, and in front of the king there are courtiers with their shoes, with their sandals in their hand. It is believed by scholars to be a representation of something that is more primitive, the notion that in the presence of God one should be totally naked, sacred nudity. I don't want anybody to get any ideas from this. We don't want any streaking at the SAJ. Henry will not tolerate it. Now, that is to say, you stand before God stripped. You say, God, I have nothing to conceal. So taking your shoes off may be a substitute, a part for the whole of what was formerly a total religious nudity. What about the healing of the leper? Yes. That's a very interesting point. That's a very interesting point, where God is involved in something which is really between two nations, and like Athena in the Iliad, God is sort of supporting the one side as against the other. Yes?
Repeated theme, I think, the idea of the Messiah having to have a prophet.
Very interesting. A forerunner of the Messiah, like John the Baptist for Jesus, and Elijah for the Jewish Messiah. Excellent point. Yes? A promise? A promise, yes? Herb? Very good. Names, very, very important. Yes?
A promise of success against great odds.
Yes, Mimi.
The fear of the man in faith to God. You did mention that he was very much afraid at the beginning when God first spoke.
Yes, I think that would definitely be a theme that's universal. But there are other things that have not been noticed. Yes?
God speaking through a human being.
God speaking through a human being? I don't understand. This is the story of Oedipus. This is the Oedipus story. A child is exposed, is discovered by a royal person. Well, discovered, whatever. And what? Go ahead. A child, the exposing of a child. You've heard of this before. How many myths in which a child is exposed is found by, well, in the case of Oedipus, is found by a a peasant, and then is raised not knowing. This is Freud's family romance. We all go through this at some stage. We imagine that as we look at our parents as we get older, and we say, it's impossible that two such ugly people could have produced somebody as smart as me. I had to have been sired by at least the postman or somebody else. This is a family romance. But Freud, incidentally, in a beautiful article says parents shouldn't really worry because the fantasied emperor and empress who the children fondly imagine are their real parents are the real parents. They are the fantasied images that the child originally had of these gods and goddesses who walk through the nursery in the middle of the night. Yes. Any more of these? Yes. A promised land, yes, a promised land. This is not the only example. Yes.
The love of God and the fear of God.
The love of God and the fear of God, yes, yes.
God choosing a prophet that has some sort of handicap?
Yes, that was alluded to before. The idea that God loves the maimed and the crippled and the stammerers and the stutters, and above all, God loves the neurotics. As a matter of fact, the whole business of shamanism, the whole notion of the witch doctor is the resident crazy in all cultures. Did you know that? You know that? No, you didn't know that. You should know that, especially the SAJ. The shaman, the witch doctor, is generally the man who just hovers between this world and the next world, and therefore is treated with the dervish, the shaman. There's a vast literature on this topic. Jennifer.
The man who becomes the chosen leader being a person who was originally rejected from society or in some way estranged from society.
Very interesting, yes. And also, did somebody already mention the one who has to go out into the wilderness, the one who has to go through some kind of test? There is an overtone of the Hercules myth here, that before one can enter into one's heritage, one has to go through certain exile, expulsion. Moses' life in microcosm is a kind of a foreshadowing, a type of the exodus from Egypt in a sense. You know, it's like the curve, desolation and then a Fagel.
The number 3, you've got 3 signs, and you go...
The number 3 is also a very common phrase. Yes, Reba?
The mystery in his name. I mean, when you...
Yes, that was already alluded to. We have the problem of the special name of God, the 4-lettered name of God, the Tetragrammaton, which nobody knows how to pronounce. And in the Odyssey, what does Odysseus say when Cyclops asks him what is his name? Well, I don't know whether that's an exact example, but it certainly is related to the notion. In other words, names which are concealed, names which are hidden. Yes, just a moment. Anybody else who hasn't spoken yet? Yes, Herb.
Trust in the Lord.
Yes, definitely. Oh, Jennifer, before you speak, I just want to thank you very much for having conducted this study group last week, and also to congratulate Arthur Zuckerman on his 75th birthday, and thank him also very much for having conducted the study session 2 weeks ago from this pulpit. Thank you both very much indeed, and Arthur, ad meyava isrim shana, I commend the manner in which you and Jan celebrated that birthday to the entire congregation by involving all your extended family in the synagogue service. I hear it was an absolutely beautiful experience. Yes, lady.
Moses is the youngest child. That's also very common, the idea that the youngest son is the one who ends up being...
All right, very good, very good. Jennifer?
The hiding of an identity and then the revealing of the identity.
That is excellent, but here, of course, it's special because very often it's done by a mortal. Here, it's done by God. In other words, God reveals himself to Moses.
I was thinking of Moses hiding his identity while he was in Egypt and then coming back.
That's another example of the same thing. Yes, Jeff?
I want to question what you said before about the Oedipus state. I can see it on a surface level, but on a deeper I can't. The surface level I can see that he's brought up by the Egyptians and now he wants to smite the Egyptians to police his people. But in the Oedipus theme, Oedipus did not know who his real father was, and he went back and slew his real father. Moses is not going back and slaying his
You're absolutely right. I'm not suggesting that it's an exact fit. But what I am suggesting is that the part of the myth, a myth consists of 2 parts. There's the overall myth, I call it the macro myth. And there's also the micro myth. The elements within the myth themselves are related. Little themes, not the whole thing, but little short themes. I merely was referring to the notion of being exposed. A child being exposed on the side of the hill. A child being exposed to the point of death. Now, another one that's been missed. Anybody else? Anybody else? Anybody else? Yes, Linny.
That he's been confronted with the supernatural, but he's supposed to look away. And he can't actually.
That he hides his face? He hides his face.
In the same way that you might see a Greek goddess bathing or something, you're not supposed to look.
That's interesting, because there are stories told of where people looked at things they shouldn't look at I know there are some very spectacular examples of this in the writings of Herodotus. I think that would be another example. I'm surprised that nobody has as yet mentioned the notion of, here it's coming, I hope, yes?
Not sure definitely, but the promised land is actually paradise.
No, I don't think so. It's very much, and I wish you hadn't mentioned that, because you reminded me of an idea that I wanted to forget, namely, which raises a very serious moral problem with me, especially after reading the New York Times yesterday, namely that it is repeated not once, but I think at least 3 times, that this land which God is going to give the Israelites is already populated by 7 indigenous tribes. I mean, just in case you missed the point, if I remember correctly, Fagel, you can count, it's 3 times mentioned, I'm going to take you out of this persecution and steal somebody else's country and give it to you. I mean, it couldn't be more obvious, and it really is something that today we simply cannot any longer ignore. I understand your delicacy in wishing to ignore that point. Nobody has as yet mentioned what I think is the most obvious mythological theme, the putting of a baby into a box or a chest and into the water. This is a universal mythological theme. First of all, what? What? I'm sorry. I apologize. You've got to let me get away with something up here. Well, I'll mention it anyway. It is associated. I would have accepted it if you'd mentioned it. I would have let you get away with it. Incidentally, babies were dropped into the river. It was like a trial by ordeal. Babies were dropped into the river. Isn't the young Brandt Schwartz lady happy that we don't do this anymore in this day and age? Babies were dropped into the river to test their legitimacy. Those who swam were legitimate, and those who sank were regarded as illegitimate. You couldn't win this one. I mean, it was unless, of course, they knew how to swim from the very beginning. Also, it is universally noted that children who are either out of supernatural origin or who are ascribed as having a kind of supernatural origin by being found floating down the river, that usually is regarded as a delicate synonym for illegitimacy. The child that comes from God usually is a child whose father is unknown. And here are just a few examples of children being put into the water. The first Semitic king, Sargon of Akkad, who reigned over Babylonia in the year 2300 before the Common Era, was placed into such a box. In the Indian epic, the Mahabharata, there is an example of that. Dionysus, son of Semele by Zeus, was put with his mother in a chest and cast into the sea by Semele's father Cadmus, and also a better known example, Perseus and his mother. You know, Zeus, who came to Danae in a golden shower, Perseus and his mother. These are examples where the mother and the child were put into a box, but clearly it's the same kind of theme. Now we go to one more point which you missed also, that Amram and Yochebed perpetrated a marriage which was forbidden by Jewish law. According to the 18th chapter of Leviticus, a man may not marry his paternal aunt. It is specifically prohibited, in which case, in terms of biblical law itself, the union of Amram and Yochebed was incestuous. In Exodus chapter 6, verse 20, we read, Vayikach Amram et Yochebed dodato lo leisha. Amram took Yochebed, his aunt, his paternal aunt, the sister of his father, for a wife. This was forbidden. And it might be interesting, of course, since we've discussed this at great length, that this is one more example of the way in which in Jewish religion, although incest is massively prohibited, those who belong to the line of the Messiah or who are otherwise elect apparently are permitted to indulge, because we know that Judah and Tamar produced Peretz, and that Peretz is the ancestor of Boaz, and Boaz of Jesse, and Jesse of David, who is the ancestor of the Messiah. That would be not the only example of this. Any more on this before we go to the next point? Yes? Yes, well, we have already had that. There are 3 signs: the blood, the leprosy, and the snake serpent. And the stick, Stanley mentioned the hilltop, disappearance on a hilltop, or death on a hilltop, is also an example. I think we've exhausted there. Now we go back to the point which several of you raised, namely, why is Moses the reluctant prophet? I don't know of any other example a novel would not be a good example, because a novel would probably have been influenced by the Bible. In other words, and this is not the only example in the Bible, there are 2 other examples in the Bible of reluctant prophets. Elisha?
Noah?
Wait a minute, just a moment. Noah? Noah? No, not no, Jonah. Jonah is a reluctant prophet, is he not? And another example of a reluctant prophet is Jeremiah. When the call comes to Jeremiah, Jeremiah says, Lord, please find somebody bigger. I don't want to. I don't want to. And God has to get very angry with him before he finally agrees to come along. Now, what I want to ask you is, what is this? What is this? What is the meaning of this? Why is... In fact, let's just look at this chapter, not as if from the Bible, because then we're going to liable to be so full of reverence and awe that you won't understand it. What is this conversation going on between Moses and God? Why does Moses go? On other occasions in the Bible, when God says to Abraham, Abraham, I want you to take your son, or this or that or the other, they go, they do it. Why does Moses give God such a hard time? Why all this dialogue? Why all this discussion? Yes, at the back. Would you, well, the translation of that is, it's hard to be a Jew. No, that's funny, but I don't think it really touches the point. Yes, Joel?
I don't know how much of it has to do with the fact that he has a speech defect, and therefore he's very afraid that he won't be able to articulate what God wants.
That's an interesting point. Before we leave the last point, it's not exactly, not relevant, because in fact, there are 2 different types of story or midrash which the rabbis told about the Jewish people at the time when God revealed the law. One of these themes, or one of these strands, is that God had to hawk the Torah to all the nations of the world. That book, he wanted to give it to somebody, and he tried every nation in the world, and nobody would take it, and finally the Jews took it. There are many jokes about this. Give us 2 or something, whatever, we'll take it. How many are there? 2? We'll have 2 or 1. I don't even know the joke. Anyway, does anybody know the joke? It's a good joke.
Yes. How much they cost? Nothing. We'll take 2.
We'll take 2, right, okay. But there is another strand in that tradition which says that the Jewish people refused to receive the Torah. That the Jewish people as a whole was a reluctant people, and that finally God lifted Mount Sinai bodily from the ground and placed it over the head of the Israelites as they stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, and he said to them, will you marry me? And they said, yes, yes, yes. Otherwise he said, if you don't, I'm going to drop this on your heads collectively. Kafa alehem har kigigit. God bent Mount Sinai over them as a turret, a roof, and he said, if you don't accept the Torah, I'll drop the whole thing on top of you. Well, that is certainly force majeure. So the Jewish people as a whole then is seen as a reluctant people. I am asking that question, and also why the dialogue, why all this discussion. Yes, Mark?
Moses is a very modest man, the Bible tells you.
Yes, but Moses wrote that sentence. Don't you remember what Thomas Paine said about Moses? He says, they say that Moses was a most modest man, but he wrote that sentence. I mean, if Moses indeed wrote the Bible. So we have 2 excuses given so far. Moses was modest, and Moses stammered. I don't accept either of those. It's not Joe Blow on West 87th Street who's asking you to go to Egypt. It's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I mean, if God can create the world, surely he can stop Moses stammering for 3 minutes. Yes. I'm sorry, Ricky.
I think that he's afraid that when he returns to Egypt and speaks to these people who don't know him, they won't believe he said they're a prophet and won't be believed.
Now, that's a very interesting thing. I read an interesting book last night. It's called Israel Now. I can't remember the title, the author of the book. But one of the things that was said about one of the problems of living in Israel today is that everybody knows your business. It's not like New York City where there's a certain amount of anonymity. So if somebody moves from Tel Aviv to Haifa, from Haifa to Jerusalem, within 2 minutes you hear people saying, oh, that guy, I know all about him. There's no hiding place. So by the same token, it seems here that you're saying when they go back and they say, who is that guy who said that God spoke to Moses? Oh, we know all about him. In other words, who can take this guy seriously? Well, yes, there's an element of truth there, but it is God who speaks to him. And there was a burning bush. And Moses was afraid enough to take his shoes off and to hide his face from God. Why does he give God such a hard time? God loses his temper finally. Why is he so reluctant? Yes. I'm sorry, the lady there had a hand up first. I'll come right back to you. Yes.
Why was a similar controversy? People assume power. They're afraid that others will take it away from them, so they want a higher authority to prove it.
Yes, but you see, underlying your comment is this. Why are Jews so suspicious? Why is the clear impression given in this chapter that the Israelites are cynical, doubting Thomases, non-believers, and that even if Moses comes back with 3, God says to him, and if they're not convinced by a stick turning into a snake, and if they're not convinced by a normal hand becoming a leprous hand, then turn water into... I think I'd be pretty impressed if a stick turned... If Mr. Engel's stick turned into a cobra, I would be... Henry, that was a winner. It turned into a cobra, I would be enormously impressed. Yes.
Background that should have made him believe a priority. He had to be convinced.
Wouldn't you have been convinced, Jerry?
Well, I think what this is Moses is asking for the same kind of proof for himself that he's going to have to then take back to the Jews.
All right, before we go on, I'm going to ask all of you have your hands up, but I'm afraid that if I don't mention this idea now, it's going to slip my head, because I thought of it some hours ago and it's now come back to me. I wonder whether Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, who in the new Haggadah, which to some now of us has become more of a curiosity piece because it belongs very much to the age in which it was written, but nevertheless was a crucially important statement to make at its time, which for the first time in Jewish history includes Moses in the Haggadah, is not in a sense a commentary on what we're talking about today. That in the traditional Haggadah, Moses is the total reluctant prophet. He's not mentioned at all. The name of Moses only occurs once, and that is in a biblical verse. Otherwise, Moses is not mentioned at all in the traditional Haggadah, and the new Haggadah deliberately reintroduces a lot of stories about Moses in order, and Rabbi Kaplan said this very specifically, to bring back the man into the center of the story. He was the one who let you... Sir.
I just wonder if there's a question of unworthiness, because Moses smited somebody down. I'd ask you the question, if you smited somebody or slayed somebody and ran away, and then the Lord made his presence in front of you, wouldn't you feel some connection of unworthiness?
If I was walking through Central Park and I saw somebody mugging an old lady and I took a brick up from the floor and smashed the guy's skull in, I'd feel very proud of myself. I'm sorry. I really am sorry. Because the kind of violence that Moses saw was that which impelled him. Judith, don't go away. I'm going to call on you. What? Oh, somebody just yelled for you. I don't feel so. I think that the act which Moses committed murder for was a kind of an act which was justified, because what the Egyptian was doing was outrageous. He was totally abusing the person who was in his power, and the person who was being beaten up would himself have been killed. I'm not talking about just somebody tapping somebody on one shoulder being a nuisance. I'm talking about somebody with a 12-inch knife or with a gun who has every intent of killing. And Jewish law says, kill before they kill you, or before they kill them. There's no question about that. So I appreciate your point, but I don't agree with it here. Yes, Mimi?
It seems to me that some stories probably happen pretty close to the way they
Right.
and that some stories probably didn't.
Right.
And I would put this in the latter category. And therefore, it occurs to me that it's the kind of a real story that would have been made up afterwards for what would have happened.
Ah,
There the
yes.
psychology holds.
Yeah. Yes, well, Mimi has made a very good point. Let me just clarify that point. We here at the SAJ, following a Reconstructionist approach towards the Bible, do not regard chapter 3 and the first 17 verses of chapter 4 as a verbatim stenographic transcript of a dialogue that took place between God and Moses that could have been recorded by a tape recorder or by a VCR, had one been there and had the technology been around to record it. Obviously, we are in the presence of the way in which the Jewish people conceived of as what might have happened between God and Moses, and therefore clearly this is a projection of the way the Jewish people sees itself, not only in relationship to the world, but also sees its prophets and leaders in relationship to God. So that clearly is a valid point, yes.
Could it be that Moses was reluctant because he came upon the burning bush and the angel spoke to him? Maybe he felt that anybody passing by might have been addressed by this angel, and it's like, who am I to have been saying?
Oh, you mean it might have been the guy who came on the next train? Yes. I'm sorry, my mind just bubbles up at the times. I have to sort of pause for station identification. In this book, Israel Now, that I was reading late last night, there's a lovely story told about how the one way not to get on and make friends in Israel is to act as if you're a macher. And that when the president of the state of Israel returned from Europe once, he had to stand in line for 2.5 hours at the airport. This makes perfect sense, by the way, and was given no special consideration or treatment. There is that quality in Israeli society. There are other qualities that are not so desirable, but there is this quality. Ben Gurion lived the life of an ordinary, simple human being. Navon is a man of the people. They don't put on airs and graces. They don't act as aristocrats. They don't act as if somehow they're set apart. That is, I think, a Jewish trait which goes through Jewish history and especially comes up in the religious interpretation of Judaism, which is the Hasidic interpretation. Carol?
I see it really differently. I see the story almost in a very real sense. Moses comes back, and here his people are enslaved, and he has the job of taking them out. It's a real job. It's not fantasy. It's not myth. He has to get these people out. But he sees that it's almost insurmountable. And it's like almost like a dialogue with himself, with divine inspiration. How am I going to do it? It's impossible. Here's one way. No, it's not going to work. Here's another way. No, it can't be done. And that seems to me the psychology.
Beautiful. I love that, Carol. This is a lovely idea. That this is an intrapsychic dialogue which takes place in the mind of Moses. You see, in order to be able to go to Pharaoh, in order to be able to stand up in front of the greatest and most powerful monarch in the world, from a people of slaves, and to say, let my people go, what do you have to have? But even Henry knows that. There has to be a shtickle narcissism there. However, if there is that kind of chutzpah there, and there is a sensitive personality attached, there's intrapsychic agony. By what right do I have to stick out among all my fellow human beings? Where do I come off standing up and saying, let my people go? Where do I come off having that chutzpah? And so what we have in Moses is a kind of a dialogue, the kind of dialogue that might take place today between an analyst and a patient almost, where one is being sort of cut down to size. But Moses is saying, don't get such a big head, you're a stammerer, you're not so hot. Aaron can talk better than you can. But nevertheless, you've got to go and do it. But if you're going to go and do it, don't do it with arrogance. Don't do it with pride. Don't do it with vainglory. Don't do it saying, well, what am I going to get out of it? Every other day we read in the newspapers about a congressman or a senator or a judge or some public figure who has fleeced the public while in sacred public office. What this story is saying, that the man who is elected to higher responsibility, not to less, not so that he can get his rotten, dirty hand in the cookie jar, but so that he can set an example to the rest of the country and to mankind. That is the ideal that is being put forward here. That the man who is called by God, and of course on our naturalistic reconstructionist perspective, we can simply say that Moses was a man who felt gifted. Forget about God. He woke up one morning and he said, this is the man who already killed the Egyptian who was killing the slave. And he looks around and he says, I can't stand this anymore. It makes me sick. He had a highly sensitive ethical conscience. And he said, I'm going to do something about it. But not only did he want to do something about it, he had the constitutional and psychological capacity to do something about it. And that kind of person is very often a person who has enormous problems with narcissism. And therefore, in a sense, this dialogue, Carol, it was a wonderful midrash, a beautiful midrash. I saw it coming as you were actually saying it. It was beautiful. This is an intrapsychic dialogue in Moses' head. He's trying to calm himself down so that when he stands in front of Pharaoh, it will be only the voice of God speaking, equals in modern Reconstructionist parlance. It will be a voice as close as possible to the reality of the situation, with as little self-service in as possible. Myron?
I wanted to draw a parallel with Elijah.
With what?
Elijah.
Yes.
Elijah's epiphany. He's like Moses. I mean, it's dialogue. I mean, this is a literary analysis, is the dialogue within the head and the psychological. But I think there's an intentional thing here also. And I agree with you. See, if I had seen the miracles, I also would believe instantly. No doubt in my mind. I could do almost anything at that point. If you showed me, I would do it. Now, I know that everybody who's read the Bible has not seen it. None of us have seen any of these miracles that are reported. I make that assumption. And so I have to ask what the intention of the writer is. If we look at Elijah, for instance, right after the priests of Baal are slain by the Israelites, Ahab is sent back to the city, and Elijah girds up his loins and runs after him behind the chariot. And what happens when he gets to the city is that Jezebel says, hey, I'm going to go kill that guy. And Elijah gets depressed and runs away to the mountain, Mount Horeb, and goes into the womb, and into the cave in the mountain, and has the epiphany. Very similar to what's going on here. I mean, he has just seen God wrought, create all these miracles. And yet he's afraid of Jezebel. And so I think the biblical writer is saying something to the reader. And that something has to do with, these aren't real, these miracles. There's something else at work here. Forget about miracles. Look for something else. I think maybe that part of the dialogue that was going on here is that Moses is looking for something else. In the same way that Elijah looked for something else in his epiphany.
That's a beautiful, beautiful thought. My Myron is saying that we have an equivalent between Elijah, who also has this dialogue that's going inside his head, but it is extended in the narrative as if it took place outside. And one of the things I thought you were going to mention was that when Elijah runs away, he goes to the wilderness, and there's an earthquake, and the Bible says God is not in the earthquake. And then there's thunder and lightning, and God is not in the thunder. And after all this noise and tumult, Kol Demama Daka, the still small voice, the voice of modesty, humility, and self-effacement, even in the great man. And since this is Henry's day, I'm going to end by saying, Henry, you have served us for 35 years with self-effacement. You've always put us first, and Rabbi Kaplan always said that the greatest divine quality is that of responsibility. And whenever I've asked you to do anything, you've always been prompt and responsive, and I thank you. Because if you've enjoyed this discussion this morning, it is part of a long, ongoing process of development in which the SAJ is trying to become a community where human beings can come together and talk about subjects like this on Shabbat morning. And you have your place, Henry. You have your role. You're one of the people. If we had portraits around this synagogue, you'd have your face up there today. You're the one of the people who made this. And also, although I hope the congregation will let me get away, if God forbid I quote a verse which we didn't read this morning, one of the greatest verses in the entire Bible, let my people go, written so many thousands of years ago, is the verse which I know you have heard sung on many, many occasions. One of the powerful things about the Bible, and this chapter that we read this morning is indicative of it, is that whatever else it appeals for freedom from oppression. It says to people, treat each other with humanity and decently. It was said originally to Hebrews thousands of years ago, but it applies to every human being and every group of human beings who want to grow, and want to develop, and want to become things. I remember once a couple of years ago, Henry, when the air conditioner broke down for a change. You may remember this conversation, and the man came in, a young man. A young black man came in, repaired the machine, and you looked at him and you said to me, I don't know, there weren't these jobs around when I was a boy. If I had my time over again, maybe I'd have wanted to do this, that, or the other. And you suddenly you had a fantasy, I could see, of being somewhere on Broadway with a big repair shop and all those people coming in with air conditioners, and you'd keep us waiting 6 months at the SAJ before they brought us back again. Henry, I want you to know There is joy to be got out of repairing air conditioners, but there's also a special kind of a joy to be part of an ongoing creative act, which is the SAJ. And I hope you don't feel too badly about those air conditioners, because we're human air conditioners. We all need to be serviced from time to time, and you put your part in that. And I want particularly to welcome your friends who are here this morning. I hope you've enjoyed being with you. We rise for Aleinu on page 192. Aleinu l'shabeach. We give thanks.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שנח